Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. The American college campus in the 1920s, when flappers flounced, jazz jittered, and professors sighed softly into their dusty elbow patches. Before your eyelids press themselves, go ahead and tap that like button. After all, we're all students of sleep here. Let us begin not with a bang, but with a shuffle of saddle shoes on linoleum tile. Picture it. The year is 1923. The air is thick with Calvin Coolidge's quiet ambition. Textbooks are heavier than most workout routines, and nearly nobody owns a radio. But everyone pretends they do. Ivy creeps up the brick facades of old main buildings, and inside lecture halls buzz, not with knowledge, but with the secret thrill of passing notes and staring longingly at classmates who probably don't know your name. In the roaring 20s, college was not quite the collegiate coasters and kegger image you might picture today. No wristbands, no Red Bull, no students making ramen in coffee pots. Instead, college life had its own peculiar rhythms, part scholarly monastic order, part vaudeville routine, and part intense hat collection. Let's start with the students themselves. The average college student in the 1920s was less likely to have a TikTok than to have a pocket watch. Men wore suits to class, actual suits with buttons and ties, and why not sprinkle in some tweed. Women, newly bolstered by recent suffrage and bobbed hairstyles, wore drop-waist dresses and the subtle, pointed defiance of refusing to faint during midterms. They smoked illicit cigarettes, danced like they had just been invented, and occasionally turned entire dormitory corridors into impromptu Charleston lessons. Picture studying Chaucer while someone 2 floors down practices the kazoo. That was college spirit. But what exactly did these young scholars do when they weren't debating Aristotle or memorizing the periodic table? First, understand that free time in the 1920s was a slippery concept. Everything took longer. Laundry involved wringing things by hand. Calling your parents required asking permission from 4 strangers to use the communal telephone, which sat in the hallway like a government witness under a goose plume lampshade. Still, amusements were sought and found with persistence and pluck. In fact, there was an entire movement of extracurricular genius brewing. Students formed clubs for everything, including cheese tasting, yes really, fencing, elegant and slightly dangerous, and Esperanto, the made-up universal language that never quite universally caught on. But boy did it make for a spicy Wednesday afternoon meeting in the philosophy basement. Let's not forget one of the most popular pastimes, letter writing. Mountains of letters. Letters to parents, letters to sweethearts, letters to that one professor who claimed Nietzsche was just okay. A student might spend hours composing an artfully ink-blotted missive, complete with flourishing cursive that looked like it could waltz off the page and attend finishing school. There was passion in paper cuts back then. Of course, music bobbed along underneath it all. Victrolas purred softly in dormitory corners. Jazz drifted like warm pie aroma from rented rooms above barbershops turned speakeasies. Students would gather, huddle close in shared sweaters, squint at sheet music, and attempt to coax Gershwin from out-of-tune pianos. Not all succeeded, but the effort earned them charm points and the occasional midnight peanut butter sandwich, served with equal parts affection and tuberculosis risk. You might be wondering, what about parties? Ah yes, the elusive 1920s college party. Ironically, most campuses were quite strict, dry, and deeply suspicious of good times. That naturally did not stop students. Where there is repression, there is invention. Students found places to get up to mild mischief. Barns, attics, vacant fraternity houses allegedly left to ghosts, and nonetheless full of bootleg gin and jitterbug dreams. Parties were never advertised, only whispered about, often disguised as academic discussions or intensive Latin study groups. Spoiler alert, no one was conjugating verbs. And yet, quietly, tucked between scribbled notes and sunny walks to class, there existed a deeper kind of mischief, one made of independent thought and harmless rebellion. The 1920s college student was beginning to question things. What if books weren't infallible? What if life wasn't all about the classics? What if everything could be jazz? So they danced between these questions, between responsibility and recklessness, dressed impeccable for both. But of all the places students spent their free time back then, perhaps the most sacred was a place of near-mythic reputation. The campus cafe, a smoky room, the scent of burnt coffee mingling with philosophical angst. Tables sticky with spilled root beer and dreams. This was no Starbucks. This was something else entirely. And as night falls gently over the Gothic arches and bicycle wheels of 1920s academia, we'll slip next into the low-lit cafes and soda fountains where students gathered to sip phosphates and share secrets, one sleepy sip at a time. In the gentle hush of the 1920s college campus, nestled beneath ivy-clad bricks and the occasional glint of Prohibition-era flasks hidden in satchels, there lived a curious species known as the student at leisure. And leisure, dear dreamer, did not mean what you think it means. Not entirely anyway. You see, when the textbook shut and the Latin declensions ceased to declinate, students in the roaring 20s didn't just laze about, sipping malted milk and waxing poetic. Well, some did. But others engaged in far more curious customs, as broad and yawning as a post-lunchtime nap under the quad elms. Let us begin with sweater culture, which was not merely a fashion, but a lifestyle. The college sweater, bulky, itchy, but deeply romanticized in yearbooks and silent films, was the uniform of the mildly active and the deeply sentimental. To don one's school colors in chenille stitching was akin to pledging allegiance to one's people. Boys puffed out their chests, and girls folded their sleeves just so. Even their leisure had a dress code. Loafers polished, socks scrunched intentionally, and collars that said, "I may have just failed calculus, but at least I look darling doing it." Many students spent their hours outdoors because dorms were often colder than academic honesty. They strolled, or promenaded, a term no longer in fashion, across campus walks, never in a hurry, their gaits imbued with philosophical ambiguity. These walks were often elaborate social chess matches, who passed whom, who nodded at whom, and the occasional dropping of one's pencil just to be noticed. It was, in short, the quietest kind of uproar. Now, if you happen to walk behind a group of sweated scholars chuckling under a tree, you might overhear strange greetings like "rah rah row" or "beta be broke," for students often amuse themselves with fraternal rituals. Greek life was thriving, though less party mansion, and more sanctum of odd traditions and uncomfortable seating. Serious matters like candlelit ceremonies, secret passwords, eureka toast, and oaths sworn by the light of a gas lamp kept students delightfully busy with the illusion of seriousness. Meanwhile, secret societies darted in and out of public knowledge, leaving behind chalk markings on library steps, mysterious letters in mail cubbies, and one time, an impressive pyramid of teacups outside the dean's office. Whether they aimed to influence campus policy or just perfect the art of mysterious laughter is unclear. But their impact was certain. Students secretly loved secrets. The library, of course, deserves a mention. Officially, it was the domain of scholarship. Unofficially, it was the campus's most prestigious napping arena. Nothing soothed the weary learner like the delicate crinkle of aged paper and the hum of someone reciting Homer 3 tables over. Some swore that a deep nap between the stacks of medieval Latin texts had magical restorative properties. Others just snored there because their roommates were practicing the saxophone. Again, ah yes, the saxophone. The unofficial soundtrack of the 1920s study break. Every dormitory had at least one student determined to become the next big jazz thing, and every hallway echoed with passionate solos of varying talent. To be serenaded at 2 a.m. by a saxophone and sometimes a jug band from the floor below became an accepted, if slightly irritating, part of college life. And then there were the letter-writing hours. Picture it. Students seated, cross-legged on the floor or hunched over desks, fountain pens in hand, scribbling heartfelt, meandering letters to grandparents, parents, and people named Midge or George back home. These letters usually contain such forehead slappers as, "I'm learning a lot, I promise," and "Yes, I am still attending all my classes," which wasn't a lie if you rearrange the definitions of all and classes. No exploration of leisure would be complete without the campus dining room, a place where sports allegiances were cemented over potatoes and mild rebellions broke out over jello texture. Meals were slow, communal affairs, full of gossip, giggles, and quietly plotting homework avoidance. Picture long tables, candlelight flickering, and someone always spilling soup by accident, or perhaps on purpose, as a romantic gesture. And so, as the sun set over another leisurely day in the roaring 20s college scene, sweaters were hung up, saxophones stored, and notes slipped under doors with poems about moonlight and overdue library books. But while daylight hours were filled with gentle mischief and tea-steeped conversations, there was a wilder, more raucous realm that waited when night crept in and curfews loomed. For now, drift a little deeper, and soon we'll tiptoe into the after-dark world of student speakeasies and midnight dances, where not all the professors were asleep. The student stomach. An organ often more persuasive than any lecture, louder than any dormitory jazz band, and more persuasive than a love letter passed in freshman Latin. In the dreamy chaos of 1920s college life, nothing shaped a student's leisure hours more than the pursuit of food, snacks, sandwiches, or something sneakily toasted on a forbidden electric coil. Let us stroll, gently now, into the well-salted world of collegiate cuisine. Dim the lights, or better yet, imagine the warm glow of a tungsten bulb hanging above a low-ceilinged dorm room, casting long shadows across a chipped ceramic plate holding a sandwich of unknown origin. The smell, a blend of last Tuesday's socks and fresh peanut butter. The ambience, somewhere between a speakeasy and a pantry. It's 1923. Welcome to the college canteen. Meals in the dining hall were, how do we put this delicately, predictable. Boiled things mostly. Potatoes that had surrendered their will to be anything other than glue. Meatloaf that may or may not have contained meat, or loaf, depending on the cook's mood. These were meals that inspired revolt, or at least investigation. Which brings us to the humble canteen and its mercurial cousin, the illicit snack stash. Canteens, known by many names, tea rooms, tuck shops, and in one school in Connecticut, rather adorably, the pudding porch, were the social thumping heart of student life. By day, they served tepid coffee soda pop, and something mysteriously frittered. By night, they became dens of midnight rebellion and mild indigestion. Imagine a table crowded with students, dresses brushing long wooden benches, blazers shrugged off, jazz drifting faintly from a gramophone someone wired into a lamp so the dean wouldn't notice. They're discussing poetry, or last week's basketball game, or whether Clarence has finally kissed anyone. But mostly, they nibble and sip and plan their next snack-based heist. Food was more than anything a form of subtle student protest. Women at newly co-educational colleges organized pajama feasts at 3 a.m, secret indoor picnics featuring marshmallows toasted over candles and hot fudge heated illicitly over radiators. These events were often accompanied by whispering, giggling, and the inevitable setting off of the fire alarm. And what were they eating, you inquire, with your eyelids gently drooping? Let's see. Peanut butter was having quite the cultural moment, thanks to Mr. George Washington Carver's botanical meddlings. Students spread it on anything flat, crunchy, or bread-like. Sardines, stored in desks for occasions that defy explanation, were another popular study aid. Celery filled with cream cheese, daring. And for those at female colleges especially, there was a near-holy reverence for fudge. Not just any fudge. Group-made, gossip-infused late-night fudge cooked in tin pans and eaten ceremoniously off notebooks. Recipes were guarded like family jewels, Aunt Mabel's chocolate dream, or Thelma's secret sin. Fudge making was nearly a sport. Boys didn't always do their own cooking, but they did have pizza of a sort. It was early, rudimentary, and occasionally horrifying. One Yale student described a dormitory pie consisting of canned tomato paste, a saltine crust, and whatever was available. One recipe reportedly included pickled herring. These were not culinary achievements, but expressions of camaraderie and desperation, cooked with illegal hot plates and moral flexibility. Speaking of which, let's pause a moment for the noble hot plate. Forbidden by nearly every college, yet beloved by all, the hot plate was the source of hundreds of melted cords, scorched notebooks, and tales of triumph. Students smuggled them in disguised as hat boxes, phonograph cases, and one memorable attempt involving a modified ukulele. Even the simplest snack could become a social ritual. Lemonade poured into mismatched cups in cramped rooms became a reason to gather. Popcorn, popped in shaving tins, was shared like currency. And should someone dare to brew coffee after midnight, a crowd would assemble, hushed and reverent, as though attending a caffeine-based seance. Was any of this practical? No. Was it efficient? Definitely not. But it was terribly human. After all, behind every great academic tradition is a half-eaten sandwich and a student trying not to get caught. With full bellies and gently humming hearts, let us drift further now into a quieter corner of 1920s student life, where not all rules were broken for food. Some were bent just slightly in the name of fashion, and perhaps a little flirtation. Picture a crisp Saturday afternoon in April 1924, the kind of afternoon that smells lightly of lilac and lawn clippings, where every breeze carries the faint promise that summer might just arrive early this year. The sun lounges politely behind pearly clouds, and somewhere on a leafy college quad, a group of students in high socks and even higher spirits are very dramatically deciding whether to play croquet or debate Sartre, who, at this point, hasn't even properly scandalized France yet. The American college campus of the Roaring Twenties, a place where young minds clattered over modernist ideas and classical languages by day, and then willingly participated in group dances with names like the Peabody by late afternoon. Today's subject, Dreamy Listener, is what happened during a college student's so-called free time in an era where everything from skirt length to saxophones could cause a scandal, or at the very least, a raised eyebrow. Now, before we get too far, let's clarify something important. Free time in the 1920s was not quite like free time today. Netflix had not yet been invented. TikTok was still 99 years and a robot uprising away. For many well-heeled students, leisure was both a privilege and a carefully coded performance. Every activity had a dress code, a code of conduct, and for the most spirited among them, a slightly mischievous way of breaking both. Let's begin with the tea dance. Imagine a ballroom filled with sunlight, jazz filtering through the gramophone, and students in finger-waved hair and polished shoes sipping cambric tea, the kind doctored with just enough sugar to mimic real rebellion. Tea dances typically began around 4 p.m., just after the last lecture of the day finished, and were often hosted on college lawns or in dormitory parlors that inexplicably smelled of lemon polish and ambition. Tea dances were not as sleepy as they sound. First of all, there was Charleston. There was always Charleston. Feet flailed, knees bent, and the wilder souls dared to dance without gloves. There were students pulling flasks from the inner pockets of tweed jackets, secretly spiking their tea with medicinal gin, while attempting to recite E.E. Cummings in time with the band. Decorum, you see, was flexible, especially when the chaperones weren't looking. Of course, not everyone danced. Some lounged in wicker chairs, giggling over penny novels and illustrated letters from home. Others flirted openly under the pretense of discussing T.S. Eliot. The wasteland, it turns out, offers a surprisingly effective metaphor for romantic confusion. If it wasn't the tea dance, you might find students in full tennis whites, engaged in matches that were 50% athleticism and 50% flirtation. Tennis was considered healthy and upright, but also gave one a chance to show off those calves you'd sculpted walking briskly from Greek philosophy to lunch. Women had just barely been allowed to wear practical sportswear, courtesy of a few daring French designers, which led to an epidemic of students accidentally misplacing their sweaters on purpose. And then there were the more pensive types, those who took their free time with a side of solitude. These were the students who could be found along the edges of campus gardens, sketchbook in lap, capturing the fragile geometry of daffodils while pondering the troubling structure of Latin poetry. Some recited verse to one another under old elms. Others forged radical manifestos that would never be published beyond a small stack of carbon copies hidden in a sock drawer. Let us not forget the quiet rebels, the ones who hosted secret reading clubs off campus to discuss banned books. They whispered wild and collected Voltaire under their beds like illicit treasure. Their parties were candlelit, their opinions were often socialist, and their cookies, according to surviving correspondence, were excellent. Evenings brought the glow of campus lanterns and the low hum of radios, where students curled around Philco sets and listened to Rudy Vallee between bites of tinned pears and arguments about whether the modern economy would collapse under Coolidge. It wouldn't. Yet. Of course, free time wasn't free for everyone. Students of color, women, and first-generation scholars often worked restaurant shifts between classes, typed textbooks for blind peers, or organized literary societies as vehicles for both social change and a chance to talk about their feelings over weak coffee. Even in the age of flappers and fast records, college life buzzed with inequality and hope. Yes, dear dreamer, Between the quiet afternoons and the sugary subversions, the roaring 20s held space for both revolution and rest. And as the sun set over ivy-covered lecture halls, you could almost hear the click of typewriter keys beginning something new. Next, we shall drift toward a lesser-known but far dreamier campus pastime: the curious rise of amateur hypnotists and psychic societies. But first, let the gramophone play you gently into slumber. Let's take a stroll, shall we? Not a wild Charleston stomp through a speakeasy, but something gentler. Slippers over stilettos, soft jazz tickling the gramophone instead of blasting from a big band. Welcome to the curious and curiously overlooked world of 1920s college leisure that wasn't loud, rebellious, or illegal. Welcome to the tea dance. Now, you might be picturing an old teapot clicking its way across a parquet floor, but the tea dance, or afternoon dance, as some institutions like to call it, perhaps to avoid any confusion with actual sipping, was a social event held in the early evening hours, often between lunch and dinner. Not quite a ball, not quite a study session. A liminal space. A lovely, sedate middle ground for students with energy to spend, but decorum to maintain. In colleges from Bryn Mawr to Yale, tea dances were a gentle way to mingle. Students would slip into their nicest daywear, pearls for the ladies, smooth-combed partings for the gents, shoes just polished, manners freshly dusted. Oh, but do remove your hat. Tea was indeed served, usually tepid by the time it reached your saucer, and accompanied by plates of triangular sandwiches so delicate they may have evaporated if exposed to direct sunlight. Cucumber, of course. Occasionally salmon. Sometimes a daring chutney that hinted at spice and scandal. These were finger foods for people terribly careful with their fingers. The music. Think slow foxtrots or dreamy waltzes played live on the college piano or on an increasingly popular Victrola. To dance was to demonstrate poise and timing and, ideally, the ability to count to 4 without stepping on someone's orthopedic Oxfords. Interestingly, these events weren't just about wooing or waltzing. They were often chaperoned with more intensity than a Victorian family picnic. Faculty members or deans, usually from the women's colleges, would oversee the proceedings like benevolent hawks, sipping their own tea with scrutiny and some disappointment. Their job? Prevent winks from turning into extended eye contact. Despite the tame activity level, tea dances were hotly anticipated by students. After all, they were officially sanctioned, not something you had to sneak out a window for. A place to test out a new phrase like swell or snazzy, and see if it fit your tongue like a daring new hat. Now, here's where things get unexpectedly leafy. The 1920s saw an inexplicable surge in the popularity of ferns. That's right, ferns. Boston ferns, asparagus ferns, maidenhairs. All of them spreading fronds across dormitory shelves, library windowsills, and indeed, the very corners of tea dances. Decor was crucial, and there was nothing more classy or collegiate than a potted fern bowing gently next to the gramophone. No one entirely knows why. Perhaps it was their feathery modesty. Perhaps it was because they looked eternally hydrated in a time when most people weren't. But college students adored them. If you walked into a Vassar dorm in 1923, you'd be met by the scent of old books, lavender water, and soil. Some students even gave their ferns names. Fernando was popular, as was Lady Sotherswaite. On rainy afternoons, essays were typed under their porous nibs. Heartbreaks were confided to them. And once, at Mount Holyoke, a fern was elected honorary dance chair of the junior class's spring formal. It declined to make a speech. It was also around this time that miniature etiquette manuals became all the rage. Small, soft-covered booklets advising young scholars how to behave during every conceivable social situation, including tea dances and conversations near ferns. Avoid excessive mirth, one warned, sternly. A lady should never giggle without good reason. Another advised, chew cucumber crudités as if reading poetry, delicately and with reverence. At face value, it might seem like nothing happened at these events, but if you look closely, subtle dramas played out beneath the clink of teaspoons. A glance held a second too long. A dance accepted a heartbeat late. An invitation to walk someone to the phlox garden after dusk. Scandal. This was a time when decorum was the playground, and every polite gesture carried its own tremor of flirtation. Because when meeting in the daylight is your only opportunity, the stakes are delightfully high. And so they danced, arms the polite distance apart, minds fizzing with literary quotes and stolen sips of illicit ginger ale. A room of quietly hopeful scholars, swirling through sugar cubes and sonatas, under the soft supervision of deans and the peaceful watch of potted ferns. And just when the Victrola clicked off and the afternoon light began to blush into evening, someone might suggest a walk across the quad, or perhaps an impromptu turn about the campus greenhouse, where naturally the ferns lived in comfort and complete authority. Next, we'll follow those scholars when the sun went down, into dorm rooms lit by Edison bulbs and dreams, where pillow fights were less combative and more philosophical. But for now, let's sit for a moment longer, imagining the silver rim of a teacup in a student's thoughtful hands, and the faint scent of violets dusting the air. Picture it, a quiet dormitory hall, somewhere between a Gothic pipe dream and a fire hazard in waiting. It's 1924. The night is thick with the smells of mothballs, ink, and yesterday's socks, and somewhere behind an oak door labelled Clayton R.H. with a haphazard thumbtack, a candle is flickering with the weight of unspoken ideas. Yes, welcome to the midnight debates of 1920s college life, a curious tradition where sleep was optional, philosophy was encouraged, and pants were not always worn. By day, students were scholars, athletes, and occasionally flappers in disguise, but by moonlight they transformed into amateur orators, impromptu poets, and doodlers of questionable Latin on dorm walls. Guided by the mild thrill of caffeine and the ever-present hope that a deeper purpose might be hiding beneath their unread textbooks, they gathered in shared rooms, leaned against threadbare pillows, and embarked on what they believed were revolutionary intellectual journeys. Spoiler: most of them were just reinventing Plato with worse breath. Dorm room debates during the Roaring Twenties were spontaneous affairs, beginning with a fumbled observation, perhaps about the morality of prohibition, or the likelihood that Shakespeare had entirely made up the word bubble, and escalating swiftly into Socratic chaos. There were no moderators, only enthused interrupters, and arguments were rarely resolved so much as they were interrupted by someone discovering an uneaten jam sandwich under a pile of essays. It's hard to overstate how central these meandering chats were to student life. After all, the alternative was lying in bed quietly considering the Great Depression that might someday come knocking, or how Latin finals were like Dante's 7 circles, but less poetic. Far better, most concluded, to argue with your roommate about whether jazz corrupted the soul or liberated it. The language of these debates was their own. Cogent and thrice were tossed around with wild abandon, and at least one person would quote Nietzsche, while mispronouncing his name with such confidence no one dared correct him. For them, Everything was on the table: gender roles, the merits of beard growing as a post-academic career, the suspicious speed of flapper dancing, and why the university cafeteria kept insisting that boiled cabbage was a vegetable and not a punishment. Strangely enough, these late-night exchanges were not always adversarial. They could be, of course, but often they were an odd mix of dramatic disagreement and deeply sleepy camaraderie. A heated argument about capitalism might pause so someone could offer another blanket. A discussion on Freud might be interrupted by a roommate whispering, "Did you know penguins mate for life?" And inexplicably, that would feel like an acceptable segue. We must pause here to tip our scholarly nightcap to the furniture. These rooms, though equipped with wooden desks and iron beds proud of their squeakiness, were not designed for comfort. Students sat atop steamer trunks, balanced on window ledges, or lounged dramatically on battered rugs that looked like veterans of several wars. They adjusted gas lamps or electric bulbs, depending on how fast their university had embraced modernity, and wrote down their best ideas on the backs of letters, or fatefully, overdue library slips. And speaking of overdue, time itself became a loose suggestion during these nights. 3 a.m. could slip past unnoticed until someone, bleary-eyed and muttering about Aristotle's absurd shoes, noticed the sun threatening to rise. At that point, debates were often abandoned mid-thesis, with a sleepy declaration of to be continued, as though the next night would surely pick up where reason left off. Of course, most of these ideas were lost by morning. Dreams had a way of scrambling them up, so that a stirring discourse on urban decay was remembered only as the night we all agreed toast was a metaphor for ambition. But even so, something lingered. A bond formed over these soft sparrings, a warming glow of being heard, even if half the room had been asleep. And in truth, perhaps that was the secret magic of these debates. Not their outcome, but their togetherness. Their willingness to keep talking, dreaming, and questioning when the world outside was changing faster than a Charleston dance step, and universities were still figuring out how to teach modern thought without losing their monocles. So now, as the midnight candle burns low and the last student leans thoughtfully against a window ledge, eyes half closed and grammar long forgotten, our focus drifts gently away. Because tomorrow brings a new curiosity, even more tender and just slightly more peculiar: the strange, sleepy art of 1920s nap strategies. But for now, just rest your mind as the echo of one more poorly cited Aristotle quote drifts off into the night. Imagine it now. A worn wooden stage slightly off-center, curtains that look like they've seen more moths than sunlight, and a rickety piano holding on to its last octave. But in 1923, college students didn't need Broadway to feel the spotlight. Campus vaudeville, student-run variety shows filled with music, mimicry, and mild chaos, became a popular way to escape the drudgery of tedious lectures and 3-hour exams on agricultural economics. You see, before Netflix marathons, TikTok dances, and whatever exactly quantum computing majors do for fun, students created entertainment the old-fashioned way, with a rubber chicken, a saxophone, and a questionable British accent. The campus vaudeville craze was an oddly refined form of collegiate chaos. Think Shakespeare, but only Act 3, and everyone's in a top hat. Or perhaps better described as, what happens when philosophy majors discover slapstick? These performances were usually held in dusty gymnasiums or converted lecture halls, where the scent of chalkboard dust and overachieving lingered like a warm academic fog. Students would gather, tweed jackets pressed, Marcel waves coiffed, ready to perform in sketches, short plays, improvised dances, and songs of questionable pitch but undeniable enthusiasm. Now, before you write these shows off as mere farce, here's a little twist of irony to keep by your pillow. Many of the comedic sketches poked fun at college life itself. Dorm room disasters, cafeteria confusion, and of course, the eternal mystery of why Professor Beasley refuses to answer any questions before his third cup of coffee. One particularly popular act was Professor Plum's Latin love song, a piece performed entirely in badly pronounced Latin by students dressed as toga-clad academics who sang a romantic ballad to the college library's broken card catalogue. The punchline? After a dramatic serenade, the lead actor opened the drawer marked poetry, only to pull out his overdue tuition bill. These vaudeville nights weren't just about comedy. They were student social hubs, testing grounds for burgeoning talent, and occasionally accidental therapy sessions dressed up in velvet hats. The shows offered a kind of gentle rebellion, a way to protest the rigid decorum of academia with a little dancing duck and a lot of pratfalls. College girls, freshly admitted to campuses that had only recently opened their ivy-covered gates to co-education, participated with gleeful determination. They sang flapper-themed parodies of old romantic ballads, titled with subtle panache, "Ain't Misbehaving, Just Revoking My Chaperone." And somewhere, slouched grumpily in the back row, a young journalism major named Herb would be scribbling reviews of the night's acts for the student paper. Last night's performance of the haunted chemistry lab was more explosion than exposition, he'd write with a smirk, before turning over the paper to write yet another editorial on the unfair price of textbooks. Musicians were no less spirited. Student jazz bands, sometimes with as few as 3 instruments and as many as 20 misunderstandings, would accompany acts with tunes that danced somewhere between amateurish enthusiasm and accidental brilliance. If someone forgot their sheet music, they simply played what their heart or roommate remembered from the radio. No one minded. It was, after all, about the vibe, the truly surreal part. Some of these student performers later became genuine stars. Vaudeville nights at Columbia, Yale, and Smith College birthed future screenwriters, novelists, and at least one person who claimed to coin the phrase melancholy banana. We have no proof it was ever used, but we admire the attempt. Outside the pseudo-theatres, posters announced each performance in dramatic fonts. One night only, the return of the sock-wearing soprano. They were printed with thick ink on thin paper and flapped in the campus wind, which usually smelled of roasted chestnuts and mild panic over midterms. And perhaps that is what campus vaudeville truly offered. A brief breeze against the humidity of academic pressure. A moment where irreverence didn't just visit campus, it kicked in the door, did a tap dance, and exited on a unicycle. By the time the curtain call echoed against brick walls, students filed out into the cool night, giggling, yawning, arguing over whether the dancing violinist had upstaged the mime. Likely, someone would hum a tune on the walk back to dorms, their shoes clicking gently against the cobblestones, as stars blinked above like old lights in an old theatre. And as the stage lights dimmed and the dance cards returned to their drawers, another odd little pastime waited its turn beneath the college moon. One that involved not duck calls or feather boas, but earnest faces, cryptic rules, and a little something called varsity fencing. If you walked into a 1920s college dorm room, expecting a monkish cell of pure academic devotion, you'd be surprised, gently, quietly, in that way where your eyebrow lifts a half inch and your tea grows just a little more interesting. Despite what the architecture whispered, brick solemnity, creaky floors, and windows that stuck defiantly no matter the season. The students inside were delightfully inventive with their free time. This chapter opens on the clack, clack, clack of a typewriter. No, not from a diligent literature major composing the great American novel. This particular keystroke concerto belonged to Benny Quick Thumbs Calcutt, an enterprising sophomore at the University of Chicago whose actual major was economics, but whose real job was typing up customized term papers for the desperate, the lazy, or the romantically preoccupied. Benny charged a dime per page, or, for those in a time crunch, a run of cafeteria cheese rolls. These were reportedly both square and squeaky. He didn't just type, mind you. He tailored. Paragraphs on Voltaire with just enough errors to sound authentic. Metaphors sprinkled if you paid extra. And if you were terribly charming and down to your last nickel, he'd include your catchphrase somewhere in the footnotes. Benny was a one-man plagiarism emporium, and quite possibly the reason so many dormitory doors didn't lock properly. One never knew when academic salvation might need to sneak in after curfew. Beyond Benny, entrepreneurial spirit flourished under the humdrum guise of collegiate life. Craftiness, like ration sugar, sweetened the mundane. At Vassar, several forward-thinking students knitted hats that doubled as teapots cozies, marketing them as head warmers for hectic minds. The textile club refused to acknowledge them, but they sold out every exam week, mostly to philosophy majors who claimed it helped catch their fleeting existential thoughts. Meanwhile, over at Stanford, there was a well-known racket involving the campus mimeograph machine. For those blessedly unfamiliar, the mimeograph was a beast, half duplicator, half glorified purple ink sprinkler. Under cover of night or high enthusiasm, a group of prank-loving engineers known only as the Inkblots used the machine to produce parody editions of the school newspaper, complete with absurd faculty horoscopes and fabricated sightings of Rasputin in the chemistry lab. These illicit publications were slipped under dorm room doors and somehow always smelled faintly of lavender and mischief. Of course, not all college side projects were mischievous. Some were simply odd. Take Beatrice Winslow from Smith College, who began bottling campus rainwater in tiny corked vials. She labeled each with dates and poetic descriptions like September 12th, tears from an overly enthusiastic poetry reading. Some said it was performance art. Others worried it might be a new disease vector. Either way, every senior received a vial upon graduation, and Beatrice sold the rest to freshmen with romantic dispositions and no umbrellas. There were those who crocheted, of course, crochet being a national pastime among students with nimble fingers and untamed stress. But the roaring 20s version of this cozy craft had its twists. A group at Bryn Mawr turned out a line of avant-garde dormwear dubbed existential knits, cardigans with one sleeve too long, patterns that faded to existential dread at the cuffs, and the occasional revolutionary slogan hidden subtly in the pearl stitches. Dorm rooms could be business fronts, experimental laboratories, or, I swear this is true, illegal jam-selling operations. At the University of Virginia, 2 roommates moonlighted as illicit marmalade moguls when they discovered that homesick students would pay handsomely for preserves smuggled from home. They called themselves the Jam Bards and operated beneath a bulletin board bearing only 3 thumbtacks and exactly 1 threatening limerick. In this room, if fruit you do seek, bring quarters, not squeals or a squeak. For jars are contrived and somewhat alive, if left on your shelf for a week. The business model failed after one unfortunate incident involving a mislabeled jar, a biology specimen, and a breakfast seminar. But legends lingered, and so did stains. Yes, dormitories in the 1920s were not quiet places of contemplation. They were fantastical little hives of invention, mischief, and the sort of entrepreneurial endeavors that would make a modern resume tremble with confusion. The hour was often late, the kerosene low, and the idea half-baked. But oh, what fun they had baking it. Next, as your lids grow delightfully heavy, we'll drift into the dusky world of secret student societies, where candlelight met eccentricity, and oaths were sworn over uneaten biscuits. Nestled in the brick-lace shadows of ivy-clad dormitories, behind those heavy wooden doors that creaked just a little too theatrically for coincidence, college students of the 1920s retreated each night not into wild jazz-fueled chaos, but into socks. Well, occasionally. Because while you might imagine those roaring 20s co-eds burning betting slips from the racetrack or practicing the Charleston behind locked wardrobes, the truth was, dorm life was a curious blend of fragrant tea, harmless mischief, and a level of embroidery that would intimidate any modern Pinterest warrior. Let's take a gentle stroll through the dormitory hallways of Vassar or Yale, or the recently ivy-adorned University of Chicago. The air smelled faintly of floor wax, mothballs, and paperbacks that insisted on being civilized. You might pass a door ajar, music lilting softly from a gramophone 2 rooms down, possibly George Gershwin, or possibly a roommate trying to disguise that she'd just spilled ink all over her roommate's Latin translations. Ah yes, dormitory life in the 1920s, where nightly routines hovered somewhere between a boarding school novella and a proto-BuzzFeed listicle titled 14 Ways to Not Get Caught by the Matron. Let us first unravel the knitting. Yes, knitting. While the image of steel-eyed, flapper-wrapped daughters of socialites may evoke cigarette holders and sloe gin, many college women took to needlework with a vengeance, not just for fashion, but function. Sweaters for campus sweethearts, scarves for chilly, lecture halls, and socks. So many socks. By winter, a well-supplied dorm might easily resemble a cozy armory of wool-based weaponry against the cruel bite of underheated classrooms. These informal stitch-ins often created unexpected camaraderie. Picture a half-dozen women circled around an electric heater, which was probably prohibited, whispering gossip and quoting poetry as their needles clicked like a secret code. Did you hear about Mildred? Switched majors from biology to French because of a boy named Jacques. Click, click. Scandalous. Click, click. Meanwhile, just down the corridor, a different kind of rebellion percolated. The midnight tea resistance. Post-lights-out tea parties became the dormitory's secret currency. With electric kettles banned, imaginative learners turned to hidden alcohol burners, or rigged contraptions involving clothes irons, coat hangers, and an unwilling bottle of Earl Grey. These clandestine teas were theoretically about caffeine and conversation. In practice, they were part support group, part underground salon, and entirely delightful. "Pass the jam," whispered a student majoring in English literature, as she carefully sliced a fig Newton into dignified triangles, because a proper evening tea must always feature unnecessarily tidy portions. Also, do you think Professor Langley noticed I wasn't quoting Emerson, but rather the back of a cereal box? Beneath such highly cultured hijinks buzzed the tempo of youthful curiosity, mischief dressed in its Sunday best. Piano stood sentry in many dorm common rooms, and late-night impromptu concerts were common. Some filled the corridors with arpeggios and Chopin. Others, well, they attempted Rhapsody in Blue, with all the inspired chaos of a beehive in a tuxedo. And the boys, well, they had their own brand of dormitory oddity. Men's dorms often resembled a hybrid between a gentleman's club and a very confused barn. Boxing matches in the hallway? Normal. A pet raccoon adopted unofficially as a hall mascot? Also unsettlingly normal. And in one delightful example from an Indiana college dormitory in winter 1925, several students decided to ice skate down their hallway after flooding it with water and letting it freeze overnight. No word on how the janitorial staff responded, but we must imagine it was somewhere between existential dread and very quiet weeping. Of course, not all defiance came in the form of recreational sports or tea fests. There were also the small but poignant rebellions, the slipping of novels under history textbooks during study hour, the refusal to wear circle pins on Wednesdays, the daring to pin up James Joyce in a room dominated by Jane Austen. These were not the headlines of the jazz age. These were the footnotes, the dreamy little margins of day-to-day rebellious delight. And so, as you pull your blanket a little tighter and let your eyelids dip into a near doze, imagine the muffled laughter drifting down 100-year-old hallways, a teacup clinking quietly behind forbidden curtains, a sock slowly growing beneath the patient hands of someone determined to avoid her thesis. Because history rarely sleeps, but thankfully, you can. And somewhere, just past the chimney stacks, the campus pets are planning their next improbable adventure. Among the thunderous jazz notes and flappered evenings of the roaring 20s, another rhythm pulsed quietly through the ivy-covered walls of American colleges, a rhythm less Charleston and more tricky. Yes, beneath the tweed jackets and under those rigid hats of intellectual ambition, there stirred an ancient and noble tradition. The prank, a gentle kind of chaos, really. At first blush, the 1920s college campus may have looked all business. Latin mottos chiseled in stone, students in full suits at breakfast, and professors who resembled biblical prophets. But behind that hallowed facade were students absolutely brimming with devilish invention. After all, one couldn't endure weeks of philosophy lectures and cafeteria mystery meat without occasionally rearranging the dean's furniture on the campus lawn. Pranks had, of course, long been considered a birthright of the scholarly experience, but the 1920s introduced a uniquely spirited flair. The rise of engineering schools and chemistry labs meant pranks were no longer just clever drawings on the chalkboard. No, now they were technically impressive. At MIT, for example, a group of students allegedly managed to suspend a functional automobile atop the Great Dome, using nothing but pulleys, rope, and sheer collective sleep deprivation. When faculty asked how they'd done it, the students shrugged and said something about gravity and good intentions. That car, like all great works of art, eventually came down, but not before half the city wondered if it was a daredevil parking job. Elsewhere, rivalries between campuses led to fierce prank wars. At the University of Michigan, students once borrowed a mascot from a neighboring school and dressed it in their own school colors. Meanwhile, clever undergrads at Yale managed to reroute campus plumbing just enough to turn an entire building's water supply into a gently cascading chocolate-colored waterfall. Don't worry, dear dreamer, it was just coloring, not cocoa. Though one student did try to sell it from a barrel with a sign that read, "Slightly suspicious soda." Female students carried out their own ingenious escapades. At Wellesley and Vassar, young women managed complex operations to steal the ceremonial hats of rival dormitory heads. These weren't just bonnets, they were symbols of honor and possibly contained secret button collections. Retrieving them was half the fun. The other half was the midnight snickering, performed precisely 20 minutes after lights out, when every squeak of a floorboard sounded like a marching band. But not all pranks were theatrical. Some were delightfully banal, the kind that proved the true artistry and subtlety. Consider the Great Chair Swap of 1924, when two professors known for their mutual disdain were pranked harmlessly by having their distinct desk chairs swapped back and forth for an entire semester. Each man suspected something was slightly off. One chair was squeakier than the other. But being proud professors, neither dared mention it aloud. It was only during commencement that they publicly confronted one another, each holding what they believed was their rightful chair, like academic gladiators. Behind these pranks, however, lurked not only jesters, but engineers of joy. These were the students who believed that knowledge sharpened best when paired with laughter. Their tower of learning was a lively place, with banjos in the dormitory halls and the curious thump of a roommate testing out yet another revolutionary mousetrap design. Even the libraries, cathedrals of hush and solemnity, were not entirely free from amusement. Libraries in the 20s became impromptu stages for clandestine puppet shows, where marionettes in graduation caps acted out scenes from Shakespeare, and occasionally the cafeteria menu. The only audience was the lone, overworked librarian, who occasionally responded with a small but sincere chuckle, a rare academic award in and of itself. In the end, the great campus prank wars weren't really wars at all, but gentle rebellions against the pressure of expectations. Not everyone would go on to become captains of industry or groundbreaking scholars, but for one glorious hour, in the dead of night, they could be a phantom pianist who snuck into the music hall, played "Yes, We Have No Bananas," and vanished, leaving only the echo of mischief, and perhaps the smell of banana. Now, as the moon drapes its silver shawl over the scattered dormitory rooftops, let us tiptoe quietly from the laughter of chalkboard absurdities towards something softer still. The secret, soothing rituals of dorm room life. Among the many scandalous cliches that tend to cling to the 1920s like a damp woolen coat, gin-soaked jazz clubs, flappers doing the Charleston on rooftops, and a general atmosphere of flirtation disguised as dancing, it's easy to forget that a not insignificant number of college students spent their evenings doing something far more delicate, mysterious, and arguably therapeutic, namely, gathering in dimly lit dormitory common rooms to sip tea, read tarot cards, and whisper about the life choices of Eleanor from room 302. Let me take your imagination, swaddled in a soft blanket of curiosity, to a Tuesday night in 1923 at an all-female liberal arts college, where the definition of wild included burning incense indoors and reading forbidden Carl Jung essays aloud by candlelight. The women's dormitory was not supposed to be a place of enchantment. Designed with the architectural flair of a cake pan and boasting a rigid 9:30 p.m. curfew enforced by Miss Harrington, the hall proctor who always smelled faintly of celery, it stood as a bulwark against impropriety. And yet, like all seemingly stern structures, it was a secret playground for quiet rebellion. The common room was modest. One threadbare rug, two mismatched settees donated by alumni who had once been full of revolutionary ideas and now worked at banks, and a small gramophone that only played records approved by the musical committee, usually Sousa marches and a surprisingly perky rendition of Jesus Savior, pilot me. But the evenings were transformed by imagination and the sheer power of organized boredom. While the boys across campus were often burning eyebrows off with unauthorized chemistry experiments or hiding illicit jazz records in the hollowed-out etymology textbooks, the women developed a different kind of mischief, intellectual, mystical, steeped, quite literally, in Darjeeling. The kettle, borrowed gently and repeatedly from the dining hall service kitchen, was filled and set atop one of those newfangled electric heating coils. Tea was ladled into mismatched cups that had once belonged to someone's great-aunt and were now chipped in all the most charming places. Sugar cubes were dropped in with a satisfying plop, followed by lengthy debates over whether real ladies prefer lemon or milk. Then came the tarot cards. Contrary to modern belief, tarot in the 1920s wasn't quite the "you're doomed" affair it would later become. Most of these students had read just enough Freud to be dangerous and just enough Keats to make absolutely everything romantic. Reading tarot was less about summoning spirits and more about projecting anxieties onto symbolic illustrations and chuckling softly about how the Eight of Swords definitely meant Marjorie was about to do something scandalous with a freshman law student. There were, of course, favourites among the cards. The High Priestess was universally adored, likely because she sat between two pillars with all the smug wisdom of someone who had definitely read The Wasteland and understood it. The Fool was cherished for his optimism and spindly legs that resembled a sleep-deprived Latin major, and Death, much to the chagrin of the campus chaplain, was often treated as an indicator of new beginnings, a code phrase for questionable haircuts or changing majors. The evenings weren't entirely spiritual. Between sips of tea and shuffled fates, gossip swirled like steam. Someone's roommate might be seen leaving the library with intent, and someone else had received a rose, not from a florist, but from a biology major who'd allegedly pinched it from the greenhouse after dark. Entire theories bloomed around who would get engaged by Christmas, who had plagiarized her essay on Spinoza, and whether Miss Harrington had once been in love. Miss Harrington, for her part, was not unaware of these nocturnal salons. She would cough politely outside the common room around 10 p.m., clutching her copy of Ladies' Etiquette, revised 1903 edition, before gliding back to her quarters with a small smile. After all, what better rebellion than intellectual inquiry, herbal infusions, and occasionally predicting that the Queen of Wands meant someone would fail algebra? It was a quiet kind of revolution, nested not in dance halls or rum dens, but in soft laughter, whispered philosophies, and a shared understanding that the future, full of careers, choices, and yes, terribly complicated relationships, was creeping ever closer, one tarot card at a time. And as the tea dregs cooled and the cards were stacked carefully beside dog-eared tomes of Virginia Woolf and misappropriated witchcraft manuals, the girls would blow out the candles, their faces glowing with the kind of secret joy that only comes from telling the future with one's best friends in plaid slippers. Of course, not all dormitory gatherings were so esoteric. Some, as we'll see next, involved nothing more than the gentle art of bathtub gin distillation and an unfortunately resonant ukulele rendition of Ain't She Sweet. While the library quieted down and the moon yawned its way across star-sprinkled skies, not every campus in the 1920s was lost to textbooks and tea. No, beyond the well-mannered world of quads and quills, somewhere beneath ivy walls and fraternity chants, were sacred spaces of another sort, whispered about under breath and perfume, wrapped in code words, and kept safely out of faculty earshot. These were the college speakeasies, makeshift jazz dens, tucked in basements and behind borrowed bookshelves, and behind their heavy, unmarked doors, when the time struck properly past bedtime, student orchestras rose with all the grandeur of an underground Parisian cabaret band, if Paris had midterms every Wednesday. Now, prohibition may have outlawed liquor, but absolutely no law could forbid a college student from picking up a saxophone and blowing questionable scales into the carpeted distance. And so, musical collectives began to quietly blossom from otherwise respectable corners of campus life. Picture it, a tuba player from the engineering department, still wearing his slide rule like a badge of pride. A psychology major whose clarinet coincidentally matched the pitch of the campus bell. And of course, the rogue dual major in English and jazz piano, who had once tried to quote Keats in a ragtime solo. These impromptu ensembles came together not for fame or fortune, though they were not above accepting stolen dining hall biscuits in trade, but simply for the sake of rhythm, of feeling for a moment that the world was slightly less uptight than Professor Langston's syntax lectures. Much like jazz itself, the rules of the campus speakeasy orchestras were fluid, unspoken, and mostly made up 5 minutes before the cops stopped by. Rehearsals took place when no one else could hear, late at night, in off-limit stairwells, or cozy broom cupboards that had miraculously decent acoustics. There was a shared understanding among them, a kind of smoky, melodious rebellion. If society wanted tea and crustless sandwiches, then fine, they'd have tea. But it would be herbal and spiked, and the sandwiches would be cut into saxophone shapes. Quiet rebellion, after all, was still rebellion, with style. Historians rarely note just how often these secret orchestras performed in half-darkness, lit by candles lovingly borrowed, or let's be honest, stolen, from chapel stockpiles. There'd be flickering light bouncing off trumpet bells, silhouettes dancing along stone walls, and the occasional puff of steam curling up from someone's hidden mug. Of course, music wasn't the only thing shared. There were whispered poems, inside jokes that broke out mid-performance, and notebooks passed during sets, not for cheating, but to scribble lyrics and dreams and notes like, "Don't forget to practice the bridge or I'll bring back the kazoo." And there was something sweet, in a nostalgic for something you never lived sort of way, about how seriously they took it. Not the fame, there was none, but the artistry, the honesty, the little glances exchanged across the room when a melody just barely held together, or a risky improv solo fizzled into something lovely. By day, they were students, stressed, smart, trying to pass geology without accidentally joining a rock collection. But by night, they glittered in shadows, pretending for a few hours that their instruments could make them immortal. And music is funny like that. It echoes long after the candles have gone out, long after the smoke has cleared and the deans have caught wind and someone gets put on music probation, which is somehow worse than regular probation, and comes with a mandatory semester of silent film appreciation. Yet those melodies lingered, in stairwells, in windowsills, in the memory of a waltz that began softly and ended in startled laughter when a cello string broke dramatically mid-finale. So if one evening you find yourself walking along the path of an old university and you think you hear the faint whisper of a trombone somewhere behind a hedgerow or beneath the chapel floor, don't be alarmed. You've merely stumbled upon a note or two left behind by the sleepiest rebels of the 1920s. They're still playing somewhere, just softly, and just ahead, under soft lamplight and woolen blankets, we'll stumble into another quiet pocket of mischief. the utterly charming world of prank wars by post. Imagine, if you will, the soft hiss of static in a quiet dormitory room. Outside, the moon sulks over brick chimneys and rustling elm trees, while inside, two college students huddle beside a homemade crystal radio set fashioned from a cigar box, copper wire, and a whole lot of hope. It's 1924, and the crackle of radio waves feels like magic delivered on the backs of invisible birds. Radio, that newfangled whisper machine, had become the virtual fireplace of the 1920s campus, not because anyone could yet afford a proper console radio. The elegant wooden beasts with their brass dials and mahogany hunched shoulders, but because resourceful students keen on tinkering could build simpler versions themselves. All it took was access to some guidance from the back of Popular Mechanics, a scavenged set of headphones, and ideally, a friend from physics class. Dormitories became impromptu broadcast lounges, each night laced with the distant strains of jazz and big band music fluttering in from Chicago, Pittsburgh, or even, on a good clear night, Schenectady. Yes, Schenectady. Hard to spell. Harder still to ignore once you're locked into its frequencies at 11 T-Wells p.m. Burgess Meredith, before he was famous, once fell asleep to a sermon relayed from Schenectady. We don't know what the sermon was about, but it was probably uplifting enough to compensate for the tinny audio. Now, colleges back then didn't exactly encourage students to tune in after hours. Lights out meant lights out, especially at the more rigid institutions, looking at you, Yale. But the radio waves didn't care about bedtimes, and neither did the enterprising students who strung antenna wires out windows as discreetly as possible. The ramifications? Well, a hefty scolding, maybe some extra chores, and once or twice, an unintended cross-interference that accidentally broadcast the Charleston into the president's phonograph. We don't talk about that night. Beyond entertainment, radios held another secret power. They were community builders. Students would gather in whispered bundles around a crackling speaker to listen to Major League Baseball games, political addresses, and experimental radio drama, which was at the time about as dramatic as a group of librarians reading the weather. Yet to those education-weary minds, it was mesmerizing. Each voice over the airwaves seemed to say, "The world is wider than this campus." And that was a comforting thought for midterms. Music, naturally, dominated the dial. This was the jazz age after all, and whether legal or not, broadcast stations were piping out Bix Beiderbecke, Mamie Smith, and the nascent croonings of a young Bing Crosby. Students didn't just listen, they adopted. Record players were still too pricey for many, but that didn't stop them from memorizing the lyrics and rhythm of the latest foxtrots and busting out entirely too energetic floor routines on dormitory rugs, to the chagrin of anyone attempting to study Latin declensions on the upper floor. There is something deliciously innocent about imagining a group of future lawyers, wives, professors, bootleggers, and novelists all curled barefoot next to a makeshift receiver, passing a tin can of peanuts and humming along to Ain't Misbehavin'. They may have been navigating calculus and co-eds, but for a brief moment, the air between them thrummed with song and signal. Some even tried to start their own campus radio stations, long before the FCC understood what was happening. These experimental broadsides rarely reached more than a couple of buildings, but they transmitted lively debates, fictional skits, and once, reportedly, a 6-hour reading of Beowulf Fairtree in Old English. Attendance was low, and yet, in the hum and fuzz of those moon-drenched airwaves, there existed a sweetness, Students connecting with a halting, gripping world just crackling to life. Radios weren't just gadgets. They were dog-eared passports. And every evening, between Latin homework and the siren call of slumber, college students tuned their minds to the infinite. Now, as the signal gently fades and the last note of clarinet drifts into static, let's tuck that thought like a love note into your pillowcase. Tomorrow, well soon, we'll trace the rise of another beloved collegiate pastime, one that required less circuitry, but no fewer strange sounds. Imagine a long, polished wooden table under the dappled sunlight of stained glass windows. A hush of gossip, the clink of china, and the unmistakable scent of scandalously overboiled cabbage. Welcome to the college dining hall of the 1920s, a place stained in equal parts with mashed potatoes and ambition. Dining, you see, was never just about sustenance. In the rhythm of campus life, where students darted between lecture halls and smoky debates on politics or poetry, the cafeteria, called the Commons, or less poetically, the Hash House, was a sacred social hub, sort of like a medieval tavern, but with less ale and more surprise creamed spinach. Dinner bells rang like solemn church chimes, and hungry students filed in obediently. Meals were served at long communal tables, often with a faculty member seated ominously at one end, like an unexpectedly literate warlord. You were expected to sit up straight, pronounce your P's with decorum, and, under no circumstances, throw biscuits. Menus veered between the industrially inoffensive and the truly perplexing. In winter months, mystery meat made a recurring theatrical entrance, charming nobody and vanishing like a ghost into ladles of gravy. Stewed prunes played a near-spiritual role in the breakfast ritual, while liver turned up at least once a week, startling even the students of medicine. On paper, these stodgy menus might sound frightfully uninspired. But remember, this was an era when refrigeration whispered the promise of modernity, and iceberg lettuce was practically considered haute couture. Food was crafted not for dreams, but digestion. Even so, there were subtle rebellions. Students would smuggle in spices, heretically add paprika to their potatoes, or trade a roll for real butter, spoken of in hush-hush tones, like Prohibition-era contraband. Then there were the seating arrangements, as delicate and strategic as a Viennese waltz. Everyone knew where not to sit. Freshmen tucked themselves quietly near the doors, like polite ghosts. Fraternities carved territories. Athletes had their corner, complete with legendary tales of second helpings, and art students lingered near windows, dreaming aloud into their oatmeal. The tea sippers' table, reserved unofficially by the drama students, the philosophy majors, and that one mysterious upperclassman with a faint cigarette scent and a tweed coat in July, was the source of poetic murmurs, sharp debates, and rumoured jazz dates. For the handful of colleges that allowed female students, remember, coeducation was still a novelty. The women's dining hall was often a separate affair altogether, chaperoned, of course, and delicately monitored for laughter above a polite decibel. The menus there were often a bit lighter, and so too was the conversation, though one suspects the giggles hid far sharper observations than the chicken aspic could handle. Some schools began experimenting with cafeteria-style dining, inspired by innovations from industrial cities. Oh yes, the allure of picking one's pudding came to campus. Trays slid against rails, and students moved with the solemn weight of self-determination. For the first time, a freshman could choose, all on their own, between tapioca and rice pudding, and immediately regret it. But despite such modern shifts, the dining hall remained a constant rhythm. a place where friendships were forged under the drumming of cutlery against plates. Relationships blossomed, sometimes just before a disastrous Jell-O dessert, and rumours sang through the soup lines. It was not uncommon for a student to propose a philosophical theory over fried cod, or recite poetry into a cup of warm milk. Of course, there was always bean night. Ah, bean night. A humble Thursday tradition that echoed through decades. Some claimed it was an act of economy. Others, a cruel joke on the unsuspecting dormitories. But the baked beans came, and the baked beans stayed. A mainstay that simmered in molasses and mystery, as hearty as a lecture on Latin declensions. By the end of the evening, as students wandered back to their rooms, stomachs full, minds spinning with conversation, ears still ringing with the hymn of trays and spoons, the campus would fall into a gentle quiet. The dining hall lights dimmed, cleaning crews arrived with rattling carts, and the scent of tomorrow's roast beef began its slow philosophical drift. But little did those drowsy diners know, just beyond the glimmering windows of the kitchen, something was stirring. Something with caffeine, a small hint, my dear dreamer, of what's brewing next. As the stars blinked lazily over ivy-wrapped dormitories and the lamps flickered low in lecture halls, something rather curious stirred in the shadows of 1920s college campuses. Not all students were asleep at the witching hour. Oh no. Some were, up to gentle mischief, the sort that left no permanent harm but plenty of whispered legends. Tonight, let us wander into the dreamy and delightfully peculiar world of secret student societies, and why some of them were obsessed with desserts. Now picture it, a chilly evening at Dartmouth, or maybe Swarthmore, perhaps even Vassar, where the air smells faintly of library dust and old fountain pens. Somewhere behind a loose panel in the back of a campus chapel, a group of students in robes, bed sheets really, with creative embroidery, gathers by the light of a stubby candle, squinting through round spectacles and giggling quietly. They called themselves names like the Order of the Midnight Spoon, or the Benevolent League of Custard Aversion. Absolutely no professors were allowed. Membership was exclusive, based on rigorous criteria such as your ability to recite snatches of Cicero while balancing a cup of gelatin on your head, or your commitment to orchestrating the perfect prank on the dean's office using only string, soap bubbles, and an almanac from 1886. Secret societies weren't just for Ivy League students with access to grand columns and Latin mottos. Even smaller liberal art schools joined the fun. At Grinnell College, various groups were said to meet in abandoned boiler rooms to swap poetry and, more importantly, recipes for brewing tolerable coffee using dormitory radiators. Of course, the more official fraternities and sororities got the attention, with their crests, flowers, and elaborate rushing rituals, but those were too polished. The dreamy heart of mischief lay in the unofficial ones, the kind that held a solemn yearly tradition of stealing the dining hall's bread pudding and leaving behind a sonnet in apology. One such collective, allegedly hidden within the University of Chicago, called itself the Society for Irregular Latin and Stolen Napkin Sketches. Their mission: to misspell Latin ironically on campus fountains and sneak sketches of their professors asleep at their desks into the school newspaper's back pages. No one could ever prove it, of course, but suspicions lurked, especially when illustrations started modeling professors as ancient Roman senators with togas and rather dramatic eyebrows. Surprisingly, even rugby players and aspiring botanists weren't immune. Secret clubs emerged with names like the Chlorophyll Conspiracy, where students would meet in greenhouses late at night, not to tend to the flora, but to debate whether ferns had feelings, and if so, whether it was ethical to name them all Gary. And what of the fine art students? Ah, the night was their domain. Hidden behind the music hall curtains, some would organize midnight masquerades, not so much for dancing, but for the sheer joy of mismatched costumes and interpretive shadow puppet plays about midterms. Everyone came as someone else. The shy trombonist arrived as the flamboyant dean, the math major dressed as a misplaced comma, and someone always managed to scale the rooftop to recite poetry to the moon, who, being the moon, never clapped, but certainly listened. The beauty of these gatherings lay in their fleeting nature. One night, a thrilling secret. The next, only rumors. Campus janitors reported finding feathers, scraps of handwritten haikus, or graham cracker crumbs in places graham crackers absolutely should not be. And always, someone had taken the pudding. The real charm, however, was not in the rule-breaking, but in the fellowship. Like-minded dreamers clinging sweetly to youth before adulthood dimmed their sparkle just a touch. In candlelight and laughter, they found something precious amid deadlines and dusty chalkboards. Wonder. And what they proved, perhaps better than any professor could, was this: that even in the most rigid of places, joy sneaks in like moonlight through a library window. And so, dear dreamer, as the secret society of pudding thieves recedes into the soft fog of yesteryear, let's follow the silent path of moths betraying where the lanterns buzz, to another kind of mischief, the elaborate dollhouse world of 1920s campus fashion. Think Oxfords, silk stockings, and more hats than one lifetime warrants. While the flappers danced the Charleston in city speakeasies and jazz crooned beneath the moonlight, not every college student in the 1920s was clinking contraband gin beneath chandeliers. No, some were up to something far more mysterious, far more clandestine, and somehow far cozier. Let us now drift into the peculiar world of midnight masquerades and secret knitting societies, the quiet rebellions of campus life that unfurled in wool and whimsy when no one thought to look. You see, in the upper echelons of American academia, with their carved oak libraries, ticking grandfather clocks, and an eternal scent of chalk dust and boiled tea leaves, students found clever ways to rebel. Not always with jazz, but sometimes with yarn. On a drafty Wednesday evening in, let's say, February 1923, a group at Smith College, yes, the very one known for cultivating brilliant women with sharp minds and sharper bob haircuts, crept into the East Commons, armed not with flasks, but with circular needles and skeins of contraband cashmere. They called themselves the Pearl Before Swine Society, and they were dead serious about their sweaters. Membership was invitation only. Initiates had to knit a scarf blindfolded while reciting Jane Austen backwards, not for any practical reason, but to uphold tradition. These women were rebels of a particularly refined variety. While some flouted prohibition, they flouted domestic conventions by knitting under moonlight in men's smoking jackets. Across the country, in similarly ivy-draped institutions, other such cozy cabals took root in the shadows. They met in basement rec rooms, attic storage spaces, and beneath the bleachers, anywhere gramophone could be smuggled alongside a knitting basket or a sewing kit filled with secrets. And so began the era of collegiate masquerade evenings, informal affairs where students wore masks fashioned from disassembled tea cozies or surplus Latin textbooks. There was no deeper symbolism required. Students simply enjoyed being whoever they weren't expected to be. A Latin major posed as a fencing instructor. a geology student declared herself an existential trapeze artist. Identities wobbled like a tippling top hat, and no one asked too many questions. Now, you might be wondering, were masks allowed under university conduct codes? Absolutely not. But clever students discovered that if a masquerade was deemed literary and included the reading of a poem, or even a very serious haiku about oatmeal, the administration would label it an exercise in creative expression. And so, masquerades became poetry readings with suspiciously well-dressed attendees and suspiciously little poetry. In Boston, at one particularly liberal arts college housed in an old converted orphanage, charmingly drafty, students held an annual midnight waltz of the lost socks. Participants each wore 2 unmatched socks and danced only with partners whose socks bore complementary color schemes. It was absurd, deeply impractical, and universally adored. The event culminated in a ceremonial exchange of lint balls, passed from one student to another, like tokens of enduring mystery. Somewhere around the middle of the decade, Princeton students began a tradition known quietly among themselves as the Hour of Muffled Revelry. Under stroke of bell tower chimes, they'd mysteriously vanish from study halls, only to reappear hours later wearing monocles none of them owned prior. Where did they go? What did they do? Some whispered of mime performances held dramatically in boiler rooms. Others claimed quiet, competitive ukulele contests. No one truly knew, and no one was supposed to. Midnight camaraderie was the real theme. The act of gathering not in protest, nor in overt rebellion, but in a gentle, velvety defiance. Sipping cocoa brewed from illicit imported Swiss powder, donning satin gloves just for the thrill of having nowhere to go in them. These student escapades weren't written in the sanitized college records or tidy alumni bulletins, but they lived on in old photographs where half-masked faces smiled suspiciously, or scribbled diary entries that read simply, "Tonight, we unspooled the moonlight." Of course, not all subversive acts were whimsical. Some were quiet confrontations with the social order, like students of different races and genders sharing notes, jokes, and aspirations beneath the protective hush of after-hours libraries. But even those acts often wore costumes of innocence, expressed through coded humor played beneath stairwells or at campus radio stations too sleepy for serious scrutiny. So in the hush of midnight, as snow tapped gently on leaded glass dormitory windows, students across the country wrapped themselves not only in woolen shawls, but in laughter, mischief, and the sorts of memories that fever neither forgets nor academic archivists record. As the masks returned to their tea-cozy homes and the clicking of knitting needles gave way to dreaming, a new form of leisure crept gently into college life, one bound not in rebellion or revelry, but in verse. Let's turn the page softly now and meet the wordsmiths in their silent hours. By 1927, American college students had begun perfecting a forgotten but noble art, doing almost absolutely nothing in increasingly elaborate ways. While textbooks gathered a dignified layer of dust and professors droned like antique lawnmowers, students across the country were busy developing a thriving underground economy of leisure, often within the cozy confines of their dorm rooms, or, as they like to call them, the Thinkatorium, or more tellingly, the napping annex. Let us tiptoe into the dusky hush of a co-ed dormitory lounge at Radcliffe in the late 20s. There's a frayed oriental rug, a slouchy couch with cigarette holes tastefully disguised by a doily, and someone crooning an off-key version of Babyface beside a wheezing Victrola. The lights are low, The air smells faintly of pipe tobacco and burned popcorn, both of which have been formally banned but lovingly ignored. Now, contrary to many Hollywood imaginings, there were no sock hops happening here. For one, actual social dances often took place off campus under the watchful gaze of church elders, dark-suited chaperones, and the ever-present fear of spontaneous Charleston outbreaks. No, dorm entertainment was something far more innovative. Take, for instance, the highly sophisticated game of door tennis, a proud tradition in which young scholars would volley a paper ball back and forth through doorways using whatever object came to hand: a ruler, a shoehorn, a Phi Beta Kappa key duct taped to a yardstick. Scorekeeping was loosely enforced, generally forgotten, and often replaced with impromptu limerick battles. Some students, particularly those possessing both a steady hand and a flair for the absurd, crafted elaborate Rube Goldberg machines disguised as alarm clocks, wind-up toy trains pulled strings that flipped switches that dropped a grapefruit into a bowl, which in turn rang a bell, startled a cat, and knocked a sock off a shelf. The final effect was rarely waking the student, but it was very effective at waking everyone else. In more creative quadrants of campus life, students explored the avant-garde pastime of dramatic recitations, using cereal boxes. One might overhear, whispered with tragic intensity, fortified with niacin, riboflavin, and a startling lack of raisins. Critics, usually roommates who just wanted to sleep, offered mixed reviews. Of course, not all dorm-based recreation was esoteric or theatrical. Much of it was a patchwork of shared mysteries and mutual idleness. A half-played card game abandoned mid-hand, a crossword puzzle that no one intended to finish, a warm loaf of bread that mysteriously appeared every Wednesday and was reverently referred to as the yeasted offering. In women's dormitories, letter writing was both an art and a performance. A single love letter might take 3 hours to compose, often with input from no fewer than 5 hallmates. Each word was weighed like a courtroom testimony. Should I say dear or just hello? Too dear, too aloof. Entire evenings disappeared into discussions of pen color. Black ink was serious, blue was businesslike, but deep violet, that was the shade of romantic risk. Tea parties were common, strictly informal affairs, except when they weren't. Ivory-handled spoons clinked gently in chipped porcelain cups, while students read aloud from Emily Dickinson or translated Baudelaire with slightly dangerous accents. The line between refinement and giggling was thinner than the biscuits. Late at night, after curfews had been invented and strategically ignored, students gathered under the sacred eaves of blanket forts. You see, blanket forts weren't just for dormitory architecture majors. They were sanctuaries of warmth and rebellion. Inside, long philosophical debates raged. Was jazz ruining the moral fiber of youth, or reinforcing it with syncopation? Could a society built on coconut marshmallow bars truly collapse? And most pressing of all, why did Professor Wigglesworth wear only brown? No night was complete without an impromptu poetry contest where rhymes were optional, but dramatic wrist gestures were mandatory. A moody ode to laundry might bring a tear to the eye. A haiku about overdue term papers usually brought several. Outside, the street lamps flickered like drowsy stars. Inside, the heavy footfalls of the dormitory matron could be heard from 2 hallways away. And with a speed honed by necessity, blankets were folded, poems tucked under pillows, teacups hidden behind books labeled Linear Algebra a Study, highly effective, because nobody dared touch it. The glow of idle hours eventually dimmed. the laughter settling into the thick woolen silence of early morning. Tomorrow, there would be lectures, perhaps even some light reading if the stars aligned and the dining hall served something heartier than ambiguously seasoned creamed mystery. But tonight was for do nothing, done better than ever before. And speaking of tomorrow, hushed feet will lead us toward another curious invention of collegiate leisure, the strange and wonderful world of Prohibition-era campus cinema. Somewhere between jazz records and the scent of pencil shavings, there flourished a curious custom among college students of the 1920s, the late-night dormitory debate club. But unlike the polished podiumed arguments of academic daylight, ours, these debates began with mismatched socks, a cup of weak cocoa, and a spirited question like, would Socrates have survived algebra? You see, after sundown, when the campus lanterns flickered low and the last clack of heels on the sidewalk faded, students would gather spontaneously, sometimes in lounges, sometimes in the warm glow of dormitory common rooms, and often, quite recklessly, under woolen blankets strung like tents between bunk beds. With books cast aside and voices hushed to library gossip levels, they attempted to solve the riddles of life, love, and laundry rotations through sleep-slurred logic. These gatherings weren't organized in any formal sense. That would have felt far too much like effort. Rather, they assembled organically, like dandelions in a sunny patch of overgrown lawn. One freshman might mutter something about the ethical implications of jazz music, and within moments, 5 others would join, legs crossed on creaky floorboards, the air thick with pipe tobacco and someone's illegal attempt at an orange liqueur experiment hidden in a teacup. The debate spanned vast and dreamy ground. Topics included: is it morally wrong to skip Latin for a matinee? Can you major in poetry and still afford socks? And the perennial question, if tomorrow never comes, is the term paper technically late? There was Harold from Vermont, who fancied himself a scholar of existentialism, despite having only skimmed 1 paragraph of Kierkegaard, and even then, while distracted by a pair of particularly squeaky shoes. He posited that everything, including Professor Schermerhorn's suspiciously twitchy eyebrows, was an illusion. Eloise, a literature major with a penchant for dramatic poses, countered that illusions had beauty and therefore outweighed reality. Then, someone boiled water for tea using a contraband Bunsen burner, and they all took a moment to admire the bubbles as a metaphor for mortality. Sometimes these discussions meandered into the culinary arts, specifically dormitory inventions of the edible, and debatably so, sort. Toasted marshmallows, scorched over candle flames, became symbols of compromise between tradition and rebellion. Consider the famous moment when Claribel DeWitt solemnly proclaimed that roasting a marshmallow over a gas flame was like poetry, brief, sweet, slightly hazardous. Laughter often interrupted these debates, not boisterous, but the kind that sounds like wind tickling through tall grass. There was joy in not knowing, in arguing with a smile, and in realizing halfway through a passionate rebuttal that your foot had fallen asleep. While women's dorms were strictly supervised at most colleges, some coeducational schools permitted these philosophical sleep-ins in separate wings, loosely chaperoned by exhausted faculty who mostly just wanted to keep students from setting the drapes on fire. In less progressive institutions, young women still found ways to gather in their own networks of whispers and footnotes, passing ideas on slips of paper and in pig Latin riddles. What's especially soothing, perhaps, is knowing that many of the debates had no winners. No grades were assigned. no points tallied. The value was all in the rumination, like gently swirling honey into warm milk, only to drink it slowly while watching starlight shiver on the window pane. Sleep crept in like a shy freshman, and by the end of each night, students would trail off mid-sentence, eyes drifting, the last words of their arguments dissolving into snores. Together, they formed a midnight chorus of creaky beds, wheezing radiators, and the quiet satisfaction of having questioned the world, even if they changed none of it. These late-night debates, equal parts cozy anarchy and dreamy idealism, captured something true about the Roaring Twenties. Beneath the jazz and the jive, there was still a flickering candle of youthful wonder, determined to shine through the chaos, even with toothbrushes hanging from their mouths and textbooks used exclusively as pillow support. And as the morning light seeped through dusty blinds, and someone remembered, too late, that there was a quiz in geometry, all returned to their routines. But for a few quiet hours between dusk and dawn, the world was theirs to question with soft voices and sticky marshmallow fingers. Next, we meandered gently into another cherished pastime, one that made libraries less about silence and more about secrets stitched between the stacks. By the time twilight graced the ivy-draped dormitories of 1920s college campuses, the serious talk of lectures and love-struck sonnets turned, quite naturally, toward the realm of secret societies and candle-lit escapades one could only whisper about by lamplight. Now, you may be picturing the Gothic stone of Yale or Princeton, and you wouldn't be terribly wrong. But hush now, for even the smaller liberal arts colleges were teeming with clandestine corners and traditions kept quieter than a library during finals week. Let's tiptoe into the world of twilight theatrics and sisterhoods bound by peonies, poetry, and pinky promises. Yes, the secret sororities of the 1920s. Most college histories love to shine their spotlight on the daring escapades of all-male secret societies. You know, those chaps with togas, torches, and Latin mottos strung together with more ambition than actual meaning. But tonight, from our cozy vantage point beneath blankets or stars, we'll glance at the subtler rebellions, those of women who weren't supposed to be organizing anything at all. In the decades prior, most women's colleges forbade official sororities. Too public, too political, and terrifyingly, too ambitious. So in true flapper fashion, the lady scholars of the Roaring Twenties did what their generation excelled at. They went around the rules with a grin and a giggle. Imagine a group of co-eds, their bobbed hairlines glowing gold by gaslight, gathering inside a dormitory parlor after curfew. They brought with them a homemade gavel, a sacred tin of tea biscuits, and an old Latin dictionary that none of them could actually read, but it looked good on the table. They called themselves things like the Eudaimonia League or Society of the Dormant Flame, usually just a poetic way of saying we like books, biscuits, and each other. Meetings were both ceremonious and silly. One might open with a declaration of, "This meeting shall commence under the waning moon," and to the soundtrack of rattling pipes, as the hot water system protested in the background. Members took grand titles such as Keeper of the Key, Holder of the Contraband Shortbread Tin, or Mistress of Minutes, whose job it was to doodle in the margins of the meeting notes while pretending it was shorthand. They discussed suffrage, subtle defiance, and the scandalous notion that one could desire both a PhD and a decent peppermint fudge recipe. Over at coeducational colleges, unofficial sororities also flourished, especially in the relaxed haze of the 1920s, when the Victorian collar was metaphorically, and often literally, being unbuttoned. These groups, though rarely recognized by university charters, were vital social lifelines. They formed bonds of mentorship, mutual defense, and matchmaking that the public rarely noticed. Perhaps every now and again, one such group smuggled a typewriter onto the roof for poetry readings under the stars, or tiptoed into abandoned lecture halls to rehearse one-act plays titled How to Faint Gracefully When Overwhelmed by Exams, a dramatic tragedy in 3 yawns. And yes, as with any good secret gathering, there were oaths. Some were serious. To aid our sisters in academia and afternoon tea, and others were delightfully ridiculous. One Kansas conventicle required incoming members to swear they could correctly pronounce Nietzsche while holding a marshmallow in their mouth. The hazing process was more giggle than guillotine. But don't be fooled by the whimsy. These secret groups gave young women the space to speak, to think, to toast marshmallows over the coals of their own potential and say softly, what if we really did become doctors, or poets, or presidents? In hushed tones and collared pajamas, they admitted bold dreams too scandalous for daylight. These sisterhoods, shaped not on ritual alone, but on roast chickpea recipes and the right way to outwit the dean, were the early pilots of quiet revolutions. By the end of the decade, some of these groups would fade, as administrators caught wind of irregular biscuit shipments and late-night Latin sessions. Others would disband voluntarily, their members having graduated into the larger world, though perhaps not with the titles they deserved. And yet the impulse endured, the joy of found family, the comfort of cocoa rituals, and the gentle defiance tucked inside each borrowed candle, and off-key hymn about friendship. As the wind curls gently around aged brick dorms and whispers through wooden blinds tonight, some echoes of those laughter-lit meetings still drift in the ivy, unnoticed by all but the moths and memory keepers. Next, we'll drift towards something equally spirited, but a touch more musical, as our eyes grow heavier and the moon hangs like a coin above campus bell towers. There, swaying in harmony, another delight is waiting in the wings. Ah, the dormitory, part shelter, part circus. In the 1920s, college dorms were gently chaotic hubs of youthful mischief and extremely questionable wallpaper choices. Somewhere between the creaking staircases and the constantly flickering light bulbs, a culture of nighttime rituals, understated rebellion, and impromptu music sessions began to bloom like ivy over the brick facades. Let's step into one of these echoing corridors and tiptoe toward a door slightly ajar, behind which a ukulele is being tuned by someone named, probably, Harold. Now, before you picture a fraternity party with red solar cups and flashing LEDs, let's dial back to a simpler, quieter sort of revelry. Prohibition may have been in full swing, but that didn't stop college students from gathering in their dorm rooms to debate philosophy, swap ghost stories, nibble cold cheese sandwiches, and write terrible poetry by candlelight. The music, often live, the snacks, invariably stolen from the dining hall, the vibes, impeccably collegiate, in that awkward socks and sincerity sort of way. Dorm nightlife in the 1920s wasn't just about sneaking a gramophone into your room and playing jazz so quietly you could barely hear the scandalous saxophones. It was about connection. You were sharing your soap, your radiator, your heartbreak, and sometimes your mid-level flu symptoms. The small rooms, shared by at least 2 students, with all their books, trunks, and that one reluctant goldfish named Virgil, became arenas of improvisational entertainment. Boarding policies often banned the most invigorating behaviors, dancing and gum chewing alike. but that only encouraged students to get creative. Banjo plucking became an art form. Harmonica duets were very real. And of course, the humble ukulele, light to carry, easy to learn, and just rebellious enough to rattle the floor below, made its mark. The strange and wonderful thing about 1920s college dorm culture was its innocent audacity. Those students were far from being angels. They rarely had the stamina for full-blown lawlessness. They'd smuggle sarsaparilla into their rooms like it was sacramental wine, then sit cross-legged on threadbare rugs and dramatically recite lines from Keats. Someone always had a tin of cookies from home. Someone always burned the popcorn. Visitors, whether from other halls or the daring girls from the women's college down the street, would arrive with slightly chilled cheeks and a glint of mischief in their eyes. There'd be whispered greetings, exaggerated tiptoeing, and inevitably, someone bumping loudly into a radiator. Then, they'd all pretend to be absolutely silent for 5 barely breathing seconds before resuming a giggling rendition of Ain't She Sweet? It was in these dormitories that young scholars fashioned their own tiny rituals. Tuesday might be flashlight shadow puppet night. Thursday might be reading aloud in different accents hour. And Saturdays were for blanket forts professional enough to withstand a dean's inspection, though barely. Let's not forget the nocturnal philosophers, lying on lumpy mattresses with their hands folded over their chests, pontificating over the nature of truth, as articulated by Bertrand Russell, and whether the cafeteria had lied about the beef in Thursday's mystery stew. In the 1920s, students wrestled with meaning one stanza of T.S. Eliot at a time, usually around 11:30 p.m., with nothing in their stomachs but a bruised apple and a deeply misguided attempt at instant cocoa. Resident advisors, sometimes called proctors, or more ominously, house guardians, roamed the halls like ghosts with clipboards. They enforced lights out at 10 p.m., a rule obeyed much in the way that a cat obeys the concept of personal space. Most of the dorm room lights seemed to switch off at 10:01, only to be replaced with the warm flicker of contraband candles or the gentle rasp of matches lighting oil lamps under hand-knit doilies. As one student at Bowdoin College wrote in a letter to his sister, "There is not a creature who has entered this dorm past nightfall who has not ended up in a debate, a serenade, or a foot race through the stairwells. I myself participated in all 3 last Friday. Restraint, it seems, wasn't the point. It was companionship. It was these cozy alliances built during the midnight hour, fueled by music, minor rule breaking, and the shared realization that no one had quite finished the reading for Tuesday's class. And as the ukulele strums its final sleepy chord and the peanut butter jar is sealed with some regret, it's time for the dorm to hush itself into slumber. Windows rattle in the breeze, socks hang from the radiator like festive flags, and in the corner, Harold mutters a final "Good-night, Virgil" to the goldfish before the room slips into stillness. But all was not quiet across campus, for in the sewing rooms of the women's dormitory, another stir was underway, a secret project stitched with both thread and meaning. Let us wander tonight into the quieter corners of 1920s college life, the cozy nooks where hobbies bloomed, clubs thrived, and secrets weren't always scandalous. Sometimes they were just a little peculiar. By moonlight, and with your favorite worn cardigan wrapped snugly around your shoulders, real or imagined, let us peek into how students passed their precious moments between lectures and late-night essays. Despite the era's roaring, reputation, filled with jazz hands and Charleston twirls, Not every student was sipping bathtub gin or debating Aristotle at speakeasies. No, a fair number were very contentedly knitting. Yes, knitting. At places like Vassar and Smith College, young women gathered in dorm lounges to collect needles and stitch scarves, alternating tales of hometown crushes with debates over the latest F. Scott Fitzgerald stories. It was a revolutionary act in a world still blinking in the glow of women's suffrage. Yarn, in those circles, was not just fashionable, it was practically feminist. Meanwhile, over at co-educational campuses, a curious new breed of club was springing up like well-behaved mushrooms after a midnight rain. Science clubs, beakers and Bunsen burners were becoming the tools of cool for both male and female students, particularly in northern colleges, where electricity was no longer just that shocking moment in a dance partner's gaze, but also a lab experiment waiting to shock actual fingers. Men in wire-rimmed glasses and poised jawlines tried to impress their lab partners with theories about electrons, while women, newly admitted in large numbers, often outperformed them silently and graciously, because the shocking part of the 1920s wasn't just the flappers. It was that women were excellent chemists. Now, no college life would be quite complete without the club. Not the club with thumping jazz, but the more secretive type. The societies that only met by candlelight in tucked-away campus rooms, where the passwords were whispered and the punch was suspiciously, not spiked. Some secret societies took themselves very seriously, with Latin mottos, hand-carved sigils, and a deep sense that they were safeguarding the future of civilization, or at least the college chess league. Others veered into the delightfully absurd. At Wellesley College, the Undine Society met underneath a campus bridge, swearing oaths while wearing old graduation robes and handing out cookies shaped like Roman senators. Harvard's Hasty Pudding Club was even older and even sillier, staging satirical plays where future lawmakers performed in drag and sang remarkably well in falsetto. Students, it turns out, were just as talented at being playfully ridiculous in the 1920s as they are today, though their costume closets may have involved more togas and taffeta. Not all clubs were exclusive, though. Folk dancing circles blossomed under gymnasium rafters, often led by passionate professors obsessed with Latvian footwork. Students rolled up their trousers and performed jigs with bewildered grace, limbs flopping with academic earnestness. These clubs weren't just for fun. They were exercises in community, strangers becoming skipping partners, and then, involuntarily, falling in like with each other while attempting a Bulgarian hop that felt dangerously like exercise. Then came the radio clubs, with radio still glowing with the mystery of invention. College, students didn't just listen, they built. Dorm room desks became engineering labs, wires snaking across floorboards like scholarly vines. The air between campuses crackled with Morse code messages of enthusiasm and, occasionally, romantic overtones thinly disguised as physics problems. Sleeping wasn't always the most popular extracurricular, but dreaming, now that was common. Between Latin declensions and awkward tea dances, students dreamed together, in club rooms, over campus lawns on lazy Sunday afternoons, in debates that wandered from Plato to pickles in a single breath, in the quiet corners of wood-panelled libraries where a student might pretend to read Gulliver's Travels, but actually be crafting the bylaws for a club that only admitted those who could recite limericks backward. There was beauty in the benign, in how students carved identity not in grand acts, but in small shared activities. Clubs, hobbies, and secret societies gave structure to their chaos. It wasn't just what you studied, but what you loved, what you built in the spaces between the bells. And so, as the dormitory lights dimmed and the rattle of rain on college windows lulled students into gentle sleep, a chemistry set glowed faintly on a desk, a half-finished scarf coiled gently in a chair, and somewhere, beneath the biology lab, a secret society rehearsed a very dramatic reading of Hamlet with sock puppets. In the next quiet breath, let us follow the scent of freshly printed student newspapers toward the curious world of campus journalism. Drift back with me now to a quiet corner of the 1920s campus, a hush away from flapper dances and jazz-laced promenades. You've heard about the parties, the cocktail-fueled poetry slams, and the flying skirts of Charleston-stomped ballrooms. But the real intrigue, the kind best whispered by lamplight, lived in the coziest secret places on college grounds, the clandestine hideaways where students gathered not just to rebel, but to rest. Let's not forget, this was an era before the hum of Netflix, the buzz of smartphones, or the 37,000 unread emails haunting the average inbox. Entertainment, you see, had to be conjured from the breathable air of one's imagination. And so, campus hideaways became sacred sanctuaries, places of pillow-stuffed corners, shared flasks of illicit cider, and the occasional wax-dripping candelabra that made everything feel just a touch more Sherlock Holmes. At Smith College, an all-women's institution in Massachusetts, students escaped to attic rooms above their dormitories, warm with the scent of old timber and new ideas. These little nests sprouted nicknames like The Nook, Cozy Commons, or Margaret's Loft, even when no known Margaret had ever lived there. Here, students gathered in cardigan shawls, passing around shortbread and scandalous Russian novels with the spines cracked just enough to suggest, yes, I read it, at least the good parts. One Smith student kept a secret kitten named Tiberius in her hideaway, feeding him cream from a teacup while discussing the moral decline of Hamlet. Another curated a carefully concealed radio, muffled with socks, to catch distant jazz airwaves out of Chicago. Sweet, crackling seduction delivered under the cover of night. Over at Princeton, the hideaways skewed a bit more dramatic. Here, underground chambers, likely once intended for heating pipes or janitors' poker games, were transformed into what students dramatically called the catacombs. Picture 3 or 4 tweed-wrapped lads sitting on mismatched armchairs that may or may not have been borrowed from the library, waxing poetic with pipes clenched between their teeth. Not lit, of course, for fear of alerting the resident dean. The smell of chalk dust, cherry tobacco, and ambition hung in the air like a thesis waiting to be finished. Hideaway culture was built around more than just evasion. It was in these tucked-away corners that late-night debates blossomed. Students questioned everything, from the trustworthiness of F. Scott Fitzgerald to whether prohibition was a noble ideal or simply a nationwide game of can't catch me. In fact, campus surveys from the time show that more than 40% of college students engaged in secret gatherings of some sort, whether to philosophize, recite clever limericks, or simply pass a hand-carved flask of spiked lemonade. No one dared spell correctly. The decoration of a college hideaway was a precise alchemy. Essential ingredients included 1 frayed wool rug, preferably striped, at least 2 mismatched cushions appearing as if handed down from aunts named Mabel, and a single work of Greek statuary, usually missing something important like a nose or an arm, borrowed from the art building under the cover of night because someone claimed it sets the mood. Lighting was everything. Fluorescents were banned. Of course they didn't exist yet, but if they had, they'd have been stoned with scones. These students thrived under candlelight, filtered sun through papier-mâché curtains, or the ever-reliable flicker of a lantern powered by questionable mechanics but unquestionable charm. And so, within these alcoves and attics, beneath stairwells and behind suspiciously wobbly bookcases, a subculture of coziness thrived, free from faculty eyes, agendas, or even the need for matching socks. Students created impromptu societies with names like the Gentle Rebels or the Midnight Owl Club. The only entry fee, curiosity and willingness to speak in hushed tones about everything and nothing at all. Of course, these hideaways weren't always so well hidden. Now and then, a suspicious creak or echo of an enthusiastic ukulele chord would betray their existence. A dean might knock 3 times before peeking in, only to find 6 students sitting cross-legged, sipping chamomile tea and reading aloud Oscar Wilde with the reverence of monks reciting holy texts. What could he say? The truth was, the students were more interesting in the dark. And now, murmur close beneath the blankets of your own imagination and picture the college campus lit not by moonlight alone, but by the warmth of secret wonder. Because next, we'll follow the trail of those campus pranksters who filled time with rubber chickens, spontaneous Latin chants, and one memorably misplaced goat. Sleepily, softly, onward. Imagine the clock strikes 11 in a 1926 college dormitory. Not the sleek, buzzing time on your phone. No glowing screens here. Just a tick-tocking clock with 2 tired hands and a chime that sounded faintly like a disappointed goose. The dormitory quiets except for muffled giggles, the soft rustle of forbidden skirts sneaking down fire escapes, and the smell of talcum powder and cheap perfume drifting toward adventure. You see, while the Calvin Coolidge decade was known for its loud jazz and louder flappers, there was another nocturnal phenomenon wafting through American campuses: the curious rise of underground student nightlife. And no, not everyone was hurling themselves into Charleston contests or debating the pros and cons of bathtub gin. Instead, many students found themselves swept up in something more slippery, tiptoeing around curfews, crafting Byzantine alibis, and perfecting the fine art of pretending to be asleep during surprise room inspections by midnight patrolling deans. These deans were a peculiar breed, equal parts disciplinarian and amateur detective, armed with the moral authority of a Victorian clergyman and the stealth of an unsuccessful ninja. Their duties included sniffing out dice games in laundry rooms, preventing mixed company incidents after sundown, and making firm pronouncements such as, "No harmonicas after 9," or "That radiator is not a reasonable place to barbecue sausages." But a sleeping campus was rarely truly asleep. Take Oberlin College in Ohio, for instance. While known for its progressive politics, it still had rules drawn from a puritanical fever dream. Lights out meant lights out. And yet, students developed an intricate telegraph system involving Morse code tapping on dormitory pipes. 1 tap meant bring snacks. 2 meant the dean is loose. 3 meant that someone had smuggled in a record player, and it was jazz o'clock. Jazz o'clock was somewhere between 11:15 p.m. and a healthy disrespect for authority. In the women's halls, things were no less inventive or rebellious. While propriety reigned during the day, at night, resilient young women covered their beds with literature that curled the hair of the local temperance society. Petrarch hid behind textbooks. Bawdiness nestled between pages of Latin. Some formed underground book clubs, misnamed prayer societies, to dissuade suspicion. These groups rarely discussed scripture, instead focusing on more divine verses, those of Dorothy Parker, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and occasionally scandalous French authors whose names were always whispered like curses or love spells. Meanwhile, the boys' dorms often turned into improvised speakeasies. Not glamorous ones, no chandeliers or saxophones, but with the same dreamy sense of escape. Someone would produce a gramophone with scratchy jazz. Another would extract a suspicious bottle from the back of a hollowed-out copy of Principles of Economics. Nobody read their economics books. They were either hiding bootleg liquor or being used as very ineffective doorstops. Conversation was scattered between dreamy ambition and preposterous theories. "I'll be a senator," one would say, while wearing socks that didn't match. "I've discovered a new way to beat hangovers with citrus," another claimed, tragically confusing lemons with onions. They passed around cigarettes as if they were sharing poetry, trading dreams and irregular coughs. Their world existed in pockets of time, hours carved between dorm policies and societal expectations. In those dusky, quiet hours of rebellion, the real spark of curiosity flickered most freely. It wasn't just about defying curfews or sneaking out through laundry chutes, though that did happen, and on one statistically improbable occasion, a student emerged from a dumbwaiter directly into the dean's study. No, these nighttime escapades were about carving out something that universities didn't schedule, a space for self-invention. The dark evokes mystery, and for college students of the 20s, much of life was still a thrilling unknown. Would they become poets or pharmacists, flappers or financiers? Midnight whispered, "You can be whoever you want. Just keep your shoes off the carpet and try not to wake the house mother." Eventually, of course, the creeping dawn would break through the dusty curtains. The real world would knock on the door, usually in the form of a sleepy roommate or overdue Latin homework, and the glamour dissolved into yawns and shoe scuffs. But before sleep surrendered completely, there was always the hope, just a shimmer, that tonight the dean would forget his flashlight, that the jazz record wouldn't skip, that someone would recite poetry so extraordinary someone else might fall in love right then and there, behind a milk crate and a pile of laundry. And speaking of laundry, what better place to begin our next curiosity? Shh, now, let's drift onward. By the time the 1920s college evening unfurled its last cigarette smoke into the night sky, and the phonograph somewhere down the hall finally gave up on jazz for the evening, most students were trickling back to their dormitories under moonlight, or more accurately, under the suspiciously flickering glow of early electrical street lamps. Now, you might imagine, these young scholars whispering sonnets under ivy-draped windows, or discussing existentialism under lamplight with the tragic weariness of future novelists. And yes, that particular breed certainly existed, usually wearing tweed in spring and quoting Nietzsche with alarming confidence. But a surprisingly large portion of students simply wandered, slowly, dreamily, doing absolutely nothing, on purpose. This chapter is dedicated to that noble pastime, aimless ambling. You see, for all the roaring revelry we imagine of the 1920s, the quieter truths sometimes slip through the cracks, perhaps because they stepped so gently. A favorite unwritten college tradition of the era was the long, meandering walk. No destination, no urgency. Just post-evening strolls with hands in pockets, past hedges perfumed by night-blooming flowers, and Greek revival pillars casting long cathedral-like shadows. During these walks, taken in twos, or sometimes threes, if everyone was feeling particularly chatty, topics floated like autumn leaves on a breeze. Students might discuss whether Einstein or Bohr would win in a theoretical boxing match. Spoiler, the match would be postponed indefinitely due to uncertainty principles, or whether the new boy from Delaware was really allergic to milk or just being dramatic to get out of dining hall oatmeal. They strolled past the administration building's formidable columns, now friendlier under moonlight, past the hungover statue of some forgotten benefactor, probably cast in bronze solely to scare pigeons. One Amherst student in 1926 claimed the statue of their college's founder would weep tears of disdain every finals week, though most people suspected it was just the plumbing. A favorite stopping place was the thinking bench. Every campus had one. Usually lopsided, often missing slats, but it held philosophies, whispered crushes, and unspoken ambitions stubborn as ivy. On these benches, students learned the ancient art of comfortably saying nothing. There was no smartphone to rescue you from silence then, of course. If the pause in conversation lingered, you had no choice but to sit with it, and curiously, that's when stories would unravel. Someone might admit they once tried to plagiarize a Latin poem using a French dictionary, or reveal they'd written a haiku about their physics professor's mustache, now proudly published in the campus zine. A gentle wind might carry the faint scent of library dust and secondhand soap. The night air held an air of unanswered questions and unsubmitted essays. Students, wrapped in oversized peacoats and ideas, leaned back to stargaze, not to contemplate the cosmos, but to avoid eye contact after accidentally quoting Dickens incorrectly. Many walked simply to procrastinate, but in the process, they perfected an almost monastic stillness of the college mind. A patient, often drowsy, acceptance that answers wouldn't come tonight, and that was entirely fine. For some, the walk home might conclude with a contraband slice of pie lifted from the dining hall and smuggled in a trench coat pocket. You haven't truly lived until you've watched someone negotiate with a janitor for access to a hidden fork. Others might pause under their dormitory's ancient sycamore, older than any professor, and only slightly less intimidating. Folklore insisted it whispered exam hints if you pressed your ear to its bark at midnight, but most students just leaned on it while finishing the last lines of poems they didn't plan to turn in. Eventually, shoes scuffed their way back over worn stone paths. Doors squeaked open, roommates glanced up from dusty piles of overdue books, and someone would mumble, "Did you do the reading?" To which the eternal answer was, "No, but I thought about starting it, and that's something." Ties loosened, lights dimmed, a final laugh echoed from somewhere down the hall, and upstairs, someone whispered to the ceiling, "Maybe tomorrow." Yes, the Roaring Twenties roared, but it also sighed. It strolled. And sometimes it simply existed, in those last lingering hours before sleep, when nothing happened, and everything that mattered did. Now rest your mind as softly as a cardigan folded on the back of a desk chair. Let your thoughts drift like a jazz note fading into evening fog. Tonight, you've walked the quiet, cobbled paths of a time when doing nothing wasn't wasted, just wonderfully unhurried. Sleep well, and dream sweetly of borrowed books, moonlit ivy, and a world where pie fits in your pocket.